The loudest laugh in the room came from my own mother, and that was the moment I realized I had never truly been part of their family. My name is Emily Parker, and the day my sister got married was supposed to be one of the happiest days in our family's history. Instead, it became the day everything finally changed. The wedding was held at a luxury hotel just outside Chicago. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. White roses covered nearly every table. A live band played softly as guests arrived from across the country. More than 500 people had been invited. Business owners, family friends, former classmates, neighbors, and relatives filled the enormous ballroom. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling, celebrating, and congratulating my sister Victoria. She loved being the center of attention. To be fair, she always had been. Growing up, Victoria was the golden child. If she earned a B in school, my mother framed the report card. If I earned straight A's, my mother asked why one score was not higher. If Victoria forgot someone's birthday, it was considered an innocent mistake. If I forgot something, it became proof that I was careless. For years, I convinced myself I was imagining the difference. As an adult, I stopped trying to compete. I built my own life. I owned a small consulting company. I paid my bills. I volunteered in my community. I had good friends and a peaceful home. Yet whenever family gatherings happened, I somehow found myself slipping back into the same role I had played since childhood. The invisible daughter. The convenient target. As I entered the ballroom that afternoon, I immediately spotted my mother, Patricia. She was standing near the front greeting guests. I walked over with a smile. "You look beautiful today, Mom," I said. She glanced at me briefly. "Thank you." Then her attention shifted to someone more important. No hug. No excitement. No warmth. Nothing. I wish I could say it hurt less after all these years. It did not. A few minutes later, I found my assigned seat. It was near the back of the ballroom beside several distant relatives I barely knew. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake. Then I noticed something interesting. Nearly every member of the immediate family had been seated near the front. Even teenage cousins I had not spoken to in years were closer to the bridal table than I was. I laughed quietly to myself. Some things never changed. My friend Sarah, who had accompanied me to the wedding, noticed immediately. "You have got to be kidding," she whispered. "Do not start," I said. "I am here for the ceremony." She squeezed my arm sympathetically. "You deserve better." Maybe she was right. Still, I refused to let bitterness ruin the day. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Victoria walked down the aisle in an elegant designer gown. Michael Turner, the groom, looked genuinely happy to see her. For a little while, I allowed myself to relax. Then came the reception. Guests ate dinner. The band played. Champagne glasses clinked. Everything appeared perfect, until Victoria suddenly stood up and reached for the microphone. The room erupted in applause. My sister smiled brightly as she looked around the ballroom. Then her eyes found me. The smile widened. Something about that expression made my stomach tighten. I had seen that look before. It was the look she wore whenever she was about to embarrass someone and call it a joke. I told myself I was being paranoid. 30 seconds later, I realized I was not paranoid at all. Victoria held the microphone with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life being applauded. The guests smiled expectantly. Most assumed she was about to share a touching wedding memory or thank everyone for attending. Instead, she turned toward my table. "Before I continue," she said cheerfully, "I think everyone should know how lucky I am to have a sister like Emily." A few people politely clapped. My stomach tightened further. I knew that tone. Victoria never sounded sweeter than when she was preparing to be cruel. "Emily has always been unforgettable," she continued, "mostly because she somehow manages to turn every simple situation into a disaster." Laughter rippled through the room. I forced a small smile. Maybe it would stop there. It did not. Victoria launched into a story from high school. Conveniently, she left out important details and exaggerated every embarrassing moment. Guests laughed again. Then came another story. Then another. Each one was carefully selected to make me look awkward, irresponsible, or foolish. Every punchline seemed directed straight at me. I looked around the ballroom. Some people appeared uncomfortable. Others laughed simply because everyone else was laughing. That is how crowds work. They often follow the loudest voice in the room. Unfortunately, Victoria had always known how to control a room. Then she said something that made my face grow hot. "Honestly," she laughed, "if Emily had planned this wedding, We would probably be eating takeout in a parking lot right now. The room erupted. Hundreds of people laughed at once. I glanced toward the head table. My mother's shoulders were shaking with laughter. Not a polite smile. Not nervous discomfort. Genuine laughter. The loudest laughter in the room. That hurt more than anything Victoria had said. Sarah leaned closer. "Emily, this is not okay." I nodded slightly, but said nothing. Victoria continued speaking. "My sister has always been special," she said. "You know how every family has one person who never quite figures things out." More laughter followed. I could feel eyes turning toward me from every corner of the ballroom. 500 guests. 500 strangers being invited to laugh at a version of me that barely resembled reality. The strange thing was that I was no longer embarrassed. I was disappointed. Deeply disappointed. Because this was not really about jokes. It was about something much older. Something that had existed long before this wedding. Victoria was not trying to entertain her guests. She was reminding everyone of their assigned roles. She was the successful daughter. I was the family joke. Then she raised her champagne glass and smiled directly at me. "Let us all be grateful life does not hand out participation trophies for adulthood." The crowd laughed again. My mother laughed too. I looked down at my untouched dinner plate and quietly reached for my purse. For the first time that evening, I seriously considered leaving. What I did not know was that someone else in the room had finally heard enough. As I sat there listening to hundreds of people laugh, memories I had spent years trying to forget began surfacing one after another. It was strange how quickly a person can be transported back in time. One careless joke from the right person can reopen doors you thought had been permanently closed. I remembered being 10 years old and bringing home a perfect report card. My father had proudly placed it on the refrigerator. My mother looked at it for less than 10 seconds before asking whether Victoria had received hers yet. I remembered being 16 and winning a regional academic competition. The same weekend, Victoria received recognition for participating in a local pageant. My mother hosted a celebration dinner for Victoria. My award sat unnoticed on a shelf for months. Back then, I told myself none of it mattered. I would work harder, be better, earn the approval that always seemed just out of reach. But approval never came. The target simply moved farther away. When I graduated from college with honors, my mother told relatives that Victoria had always been the more naturally gifted daughter. When I started my consulting business, she warned everyone that it would probably fail within a year. 5 years later, when the company was thriving, she described my success as luck. Victoria, meanwhile, never seemed required to prove anything. She was celebrated before accomplishments arrived. I was expected to justify mine after they happened. The most painful part was that my father saw it clearly. Robert Parker spent years trying to balance what my mother constantly tilted. Whenever he attended my business presentations, he sat in the front row. Whenever I doubted myself, he reminded me that my worth was not determined by anyone else's opinion. After he passed away several years earlier, the last real buffer inside our family disappeared. Since then, the favoritism had become impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, Victoria continued speaking while guests laughed obediently at each carefully crafted story. Some of the people laughing had never met me before. They knew nothing about my life. They were responding to the version of me being presented from the stage. A version designed for entertainment. Sarah reached for my hand beneath the table. "You do not deserve this," she whispered. I appreciated her support, but surprisingly, I no longer felt humiliated. The humiliation belonged to the people creating the spectacle. What I felt was clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped asking why my mother treated us differently. I stopped wondering what I could have done to earn equal affection. Sitting in that ballroom, surrounded by 500 guests, I finally accepted something I should have accepted long ago. The problem had never been me. Victoria suddenly pointed toward my table again. "You have to admit," she laughed into the microphone, "Emily has always been the family member most likely to turn a simple situation into a personal crisis." More laughter followed. I glanced toward the head table. My mother was smiling proudly. Not at me. At Victoria. The same expression she had worn my entire life. Slowly, I stood from my chair and picked up my purse. I had no intention of causing a scene. I simply decided I had heard enough. What I did not realize was that another person had been watching the entire situation unfold with growing discomfort. And in less than a minute, he would change the direction of the entire evening. As I rose from my chair, the ballroom seemed to blur around me. The music had stopped long ago. The only sound was Victoria's voice carrying through the speakers as she continued collecting laughs at my expense. I took a deep breath and adjusted the strap of my purse. I was not angry. Strangely, I felt calm. There comes a point when disappointment becomes so familiar that it loses the power to shock you. I thought I had reached that point. Then Victoria decided to push even further. "Do not leave yet, Emily," she called from the stage. Several guests turned to look at me. I have not even gotten to the best stories. More laughter followed. I noticed a few people exchange uncomfortable glances. Even they seemed to realize the joke had gone on too long. Victoria either did not notice or did not care. "You know," she continued, "people always ask me what it was like growing up with Emily. I tell them it was like having a permanent warning label in the family." The room laughed again, although less enthusiastically this time. I glanced toward my mother. Patricia smiled approvingly from her seat near the bridal table. That familiar feeling returned. Not sadness, not humiliation, just certainty. Nothing I could say would change how they saw me. For years I had tried. I had worked harder, achieved more, been more patient, been more forgiving. None of it mattered because the role had already been assigned. Victoria was the success story. I was the punchline. Sarah stood beside me. "Let us go," she whispered. I nodded. We began walking toward the ballroom exit. Then something unexpected happened. "Victoria," a voice said calmly from the head table. The microphone amplified it throughout the room. Every conversation stopped instantly. Victoria turned. So did everyone else. Michael Turner had just stood up. At first, guests smiled. They assumed the groom was about to join the speech. Perhaps he was going to tell a funny story about married life or thank everyone for attending. Instead, Michael looked directly at Victoria. His expression was not amused. "I think that is enough," he said. The room became silent. Victoria laughed awkwardly. "Enough what?" "Enough embarrassing your sister." Several hundred people froze. You could feel the atmosphere shift. Victoria forced another smile. "Michael, it is only a joke." "No," he replied evenly. "A joke is something everyone enjoys. Emily is clearly not enjoying this." The silence grew heavier. I stopped walking and turned back toward the stage. Patricia looked stunned. Victoria blinked rapidly as if she could not process what was happening. Michael stepped forward and gently took the microphone from her hand. "There is something that has bothered me for years," he said, looking around the ballroom. "And tonight seems like the right time to finally say it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Even the servers had stopped moving. Victoria's confident smile had completely disappeared. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. Michael glanced toward me. Then he looked back at the audience. "The problem," he said slowly, "is that almost everything Victoria just told you leaves out the most important part of the story." The ballroom remained completely silent. 500 guests sat frozen as Michael stood alone holding the microphone. Victoria stared at him as though she had never seen him before. Patricia looked equally stunned. Neither woman seemed prepared for what was happening. Michael waited several seconds before continuing. "The stories Victoria shared tonight are based on real events," he said calmly. "But what she forgot to mention is what actually happened afterward." A few guests shifted in their seats. Nobody laughed anymore. Michael turned toward one of the tables near the front. "Remember the story about Emily struggling to keep her business open during its first year?" Victoria's smile returned slightly. "Michael, this is not necessary." He ignored her. "What Victoria did not tell you is that Emily eventually built that company into one of the most respected consulting firms in the region." Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Michael continued. "And when Victoria needed professional advice 2 years ago, guess who spent dozens of hours helping her without charging a single dollar?" His eyes moved toward me. I immediately looked down. Victoria's face tightened. Michael was not finished. "The answer is Emily." The room grew quieter somehow. "The story about Emily making mistakes is interesting," he continued, "because every time I have personally witnessed a family crisis, she has been the person solving it." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Michael began listing examples. Not dramatic examples. Real ones. Practical ones. When a cousin faced unexpected medical expenses, Emily organized support. When an elderly aunt needed help relocating, Emily spent weekends handling the logistics. When family members needed advice, transportation, paperwork assistance, or simply someone willing to listen, Emily showed up. Again and again. Without attention. without recognition, without demanding praise. I could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward me. The attention made me uncomfortable. Michael noticed. That reaction right there is exactly my point, he said. Emily never asks for credit. Victoria crossed her arms. Why are we talking about this at my wedding? The question hung in the air. Michael answered immediately. Because you chose to make your sister the subject of your wedding speech. Several guests nodded subtly. Others looked away from Victoria. The atmosphere had completely changed. For the first time all evening, people were questioning the narrative they had been given. Michael took a slow breath. I have listened to these jokes for years, he said. I stayed quiet because I thought they were harmless. Tonight, I realized they were not harmless at all. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. The truth is that many of the accomplishments being celebrated in this family happened because someone worked behind the scenes helping everyone else succeed. He paused and looked directly at me. And that person was usually Emily. My heart pounded. I wanted the moment to end. I wanted to disappear. Yet part of me felt something unfamiliar. Validation. Not because someone was defending me. Because someone was finally telling the truth. Then Michael reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. There is something else everyone should know, he said quietly. Something I have kept for years. And as he pulled out a folded envelope, I saw my mother's expression change completely. The moment I saw the envelope, I understood why my mother's expression had changed. Patricia was no longer embarrassed. She was afraid. Not the kind of fear that comes from public attention. The kind that comes from knowing a secret is about to become visible. Michael held the envelope carefully as he looked across the ballroom. A few years ago, shortly before Robert passed away, he asked me to keep something safe, he said. The room remained silent. Even the band members stood motionless near the stage. At the time, I did not fully understand why it mattered. He glanced toward my mother. Now I do. Victoria stepped forward. Michael, this is completely inappropriate. Is it? He asked calmly. Because humiliating your sister in front of 500 guests seemed appropriate a few minutes ago. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Michael unfolded the envelope and removed several sheets of paper. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. My chest tightened. I had not seen that familiar handwriting in years. Suddenly, none of the wedding decorations mattered anymore. None of the guests mattered. For a moment, it felt as though my father was somehow present in the room again. Michael looked down at the pages. This is not a legal document, he explained. It is a personal letter. Patricia stared at the floor. Victoria looked increasingly nervous. Robert wrote this during the final months of his life. Michael continued. He asked me to keep it private until the right moment. He paused briefly before reading. To whoever reads this someday, there is something important I want understood. My heart pounded. Michael continued. People often measure success by visibility. They celebrate the loudest achievements and overlook the quiet ones. I have spent years watching both of my daughters grow into adults. One enjoys attention. The other rarely seeks it. The ballroom remained completely still. If I am being honest, the person I admire most is Emily. A visible reaction moved through the crowd. Several guests turned toward me immediately. Others looked at Patricia. I felt frozen in place. Michael kept reading. Emily does not help people because she wants recognition. She helps because she believes it is the right thing to do. She works harder than anyone realizes. She carries burdens quietly. She gives more than she receives. Tears filled my eyes. My father had never spoken that way publicly when he was alive. Hearing those words now felt overwhelming. Michael continued. I worry that many people overlook her value because she does not demand attention. That would be a mistake. If there is one lesson I hope my family remembers, it is that character matters more than applause. Across the ballroom, several guests were already wiping away tears. Others looked deeply uncomfortable, not because of anything my father had written, because they had spent the last hour laughing at someone he clearly respected. Michael turned the page. Emily has been my greatest source of pride. The sentence landed like thunder. Patricia closed her eyes. Victoria stared at the floor. Neither woman looked toward me anymore. Michael lowered the papers slightly. There is more, he said quietly, and I think everyone here deserves to hear it. Michael looked across the ballroom before continuing. The silence felt almost unreal. Only an hour earlier, the room had been filled with laughter, music, and celebration. Now 500 people sat quietly listening to words written by a man who was no longer there to speak for himself. Michael glanced down at the next page. Robert wrote something else that I think matters tonight, he said. Then he continued reading. One of my greatest regrets is that Emily rarely receives the credit she deserves. Not because she lacks accomplishments, but because she has spent much of her life surrounded by people who expect her strength and overlook her sacrifices. A murmur moved through the crowd. Several relatives lowered their eyes. I could see recognition appearing on faces throughout the ballroom. They were remembering things. Family gatherings, holidays, emergencies, moments when I quietly stepped in to help without expecting anything in return. Michael continued, if there comes a day when Emily doubts her value, I hope someone reminds her of this truth. Character is revealed not by how loudly a person speaks, but by how consistently they show up when others need them. My vision blurred with tears. Sarah squeezed my hand. For years I had carried questions that never seemed to have answers. Why was I never enough? Why did every achievement feel invisible? Why did approval always belong to someone else? Hearing my father's words did not erase those years, but it gave me something I had not expected. Peace. Michael folded the page slightly and looked toward the guests. There is something else everyone should know, he said. Over the last 4 years, I have personally watched Emily help this family again and again. Victoria remained silent. Patricia still would not look in my direction. When my business struggled during the pandemic, Emily spent weekends helping me reorganize operations. Several people looked surprised. Michael smiled sadly. She never told anyone. He continued. When Victoria and I had financial concerns while buying our first home, Emily connected us with experts who helped us avoid expensive mistakes. More surprised expressions appeared. She never told anyone that either. The stories continued. One after another. Real examples. Small acts of generosity. Quiet moments of support. Things I had never considered extraordinary because helping people simply felt normal to me. Yet hearing them described publicly changed something. For the first time, others could see the full picture instead of isolated fragments. Then Michael lowered the papers. The problem is not that Emily failed to contribute, he said. The problem is that too many people became comfortable benefiting from her kindness while pretending it did not exist. The words landed heavily throughout the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. Across the ballroom, I finally saw my mother lift her head. Her expression had changed completely. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time in my life, she looked as though she was seeing the situation through someone else's eyes. Michael carefully placed the letter on the podium. And now, he said quietly, I want to read the final section Robert wrote. The room became silent once again. Something told me that whatever came next was about to change everything. Michael unfolded the final page and looked down for several seconds before speaking. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. This is the last section Robert wrote, he said quietly. Then he began reading. If my family is reading this after I am gone, I hope they remember something important. Love is not measured by attention. It is measured by consistency. The people who truly care for us are often the ones working quietly in the background while others stand in the spotlight. A deep silence settled over the room. Michael continued. I have watched Emily spend years putting family before herself. I have watched her offer support without conditions. I have watched her forgive things that should never have required forgiveness. If there is one thing I hope she never forgets, it is that her value does not depend on whether other people recognize it. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Around the ballroom, many guests were openly emotional. Even people who barely knew me seemed moved by my father's words. Michael read on. There may come a day when Emily feels alone. If that day arrives, I want her to remember that I always saw her clearly. I saw her integrity. I saw her generosity. I saw her strength. And I was proud of her every single day. My chest tightened. Those were the words I had spent decades needing to hear. Not because they changed who I was, but because they confirmed what I had begun to understand about myself. The letter was never really about proving my worth to others. It was about finally accepting it for myself. Michael lowered the page slightly. There is one final paragraph, he said. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Robert ended his letter with this. He took a breath and continued. To my family, I ask one thing. Be careful not to mistake confidence for character. The loudest voice in the room is not always the wisest. The most visible person is not always the strongest. Sometimes the person carrying the greatest burden is the one receiving the least appreciation. If you are fortunate enough to have someone like Emily in your life, do not wait until it is too late to tell them they matter. The final sentence seemed to echo throughout the ballroom. Michael slowly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. For several moments, nobody reacted. Then something unexpected happened. A woman near the front began applauding softly. Another guest joined her. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Hundreds of people stood and applauded. Not for a performance, not for a speech, for the truth. I stood frozen as the sound filled the room. My mother remained seated, tears visible in her eyes. Victoria stared silently at the floor. Neither woman looked angry anymore. They looked confronted by something far more difficult. Reality. As the applause continued, I realized the evening was no longer about humiliation. It was no longer about old family roles. For the first time in my life, the story being told about me belonged to the truth instead of someone else's opinion. And although I did not know what would happen next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was finally free from the role they had assigned me years ago. The applause seemed to last forever. I stood motionless beside my table while hundreds of people remained on their feet. For most of my life, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally be seen. I thought it would bring satisfaction, vindication, maybe even triumph. Instead, what I felt was relief. Pure relief. The exhausting weight I had carried for decades suddenly felt lighter. Slowly, the applause began to fade. Guests returned to their seats. Conversations remained quiet. Nobody seemed interested in celebrating gossip anymore. The atmosphere had changed completely. Michael stepped away from the microphone and placed the envelope carefully on the table beside him. He looked toward me and offered a small nod. It was not the gesture of a hero seeking recognition. It was simply the gesture of someone who had chosen honesty when silence would have been easier. I nodded back. Then something happened that I never expected. My mother stood. Patricia Parker rose slowly from her chair and walked toward me. 500 guests watched in complete silence. A younger version of myself would have been terrified by that attention, but I was no longer that person. When my mother finally stopped in front of me, she seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The certainty she had carried for years was gone. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Emily," she said quietly. For several seconds, she could not continue. "I do not know if I can ever fix the hurt I caused." The room remained silent. "But your father was right, and I should have listened sooner." I did not know what to say. No dramatic speech came to mind. No perfect response appeared, because real life rarely works that way. Sometimes the most honest answer is the simplest one. "I loved you anyway," I said softly. My mother's face crumpled. She nodded and stepped aside. A few moments later, Victoria approached. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had started the evening holding a microphone. "I spent years competing with someone who was never competing with me," she admitted. "I think I knew that. I just did not want to admit it." Her voice shook slightly. "I am sorry, Emily." I studied her face. For the first time, I saw vulnerability instead of arrogance. I saw a sister instead of a rival. Forgiveness did not arrive instantly. Some wounds require time. But bitterness no longer felt necessary. "Take care of your marriage," I told her. "That is what matters tonight." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Later, after the reception finally ended, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Sarah joined me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then she smiled. "Your father would have been proud." I looked up at the stars. For the first time in many years, I believed that completely. The evening that began with humiliation ended with something far more valuable than revenge. Truth. Truth did not embarrass anyone. Truth simply revealed what had always been there. As I walked toward my car, I realized something important. My worth had never depended on my mother's approval. It had never depended on my sister's opinion. It had never depended on applause. The day they tried to make me feel small became the day I finally understood how much space I was allowed to occupy in my own life. And as I drove away, carrying my father's words with me, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace.